Thank you, Deborah. I'm a little sad you didn't hit record. I wanted to keep that awesome introduction on the record, but thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Clayton. As Deborah said, I'm an educator and especially in environmental education and psychology, and a former failed game designer, commercial game designer, and now a serious games designer. Um, we're going to dive into some things today that are a little bit heavy. Because my specialty is not game design, right? The people here in this room are already amazing game designers, game writers, and game developers. So what I'm going to try to bring to the table today is a little more specialized knowledge in environmental psychology and sort of how we understand the impact of education in environmental behavior. I will try not to get too excited about the really nerdy psychological theory stuff, but I hope you will forgive me if I do, because I am a PhD candidate, and that is just what we get excited about. But without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to the presentation, and we will get moving. All right. I hope everyone can see that. Deborah, can you confirm that we're good to go?
I can confirm we're good to go.
Awesome. Thank you for repeating it verbatim. So I feel like I feel very official now. Thank you. So today I want to talk to you about the three tiers or pillars of environmental action. And those are attitude, efficacy, and knowledge. And we're going to dive into each of them in detail as we go. Well, to some detail. I won't get too lost in the weeds, I hope. But the quick overview is that environmental psychology has recently really tried to tie education interventions and where people are on an environmental psychology level to their actual behaviors and actions, because for a long time we've struggled with how do we transfer all of this really wonderful work environmentalists are doing and educators are doing into real action without having to rely on massive movements that are put together by corporations or put together by governments. And those are really important, but helping to empower individuals is important too. And so that's what we're going to try to talk about today. And these three ideas, attitude, efficacy, and knowledge, are the industry standard, if you want to call education an industry, the industry standard of how we understand what someone needs to be individually a pro-environmental actor. So these three tiers, I'm going to start with knowledge, but a quick overview of what they all mean. So knowledge usually involves an awareness of the problem, right? You got to know that climate change is an issue, understanding the relationships in the system, meaning knowing and understanding why your actions are important in that system, and then having action-oriented knowledge, meaning knowing how to influence that system. Attitude and efficacy are a little bit more subjective and complex than that, and we'll get to them in more detail later. But for the moment, I want us to kind of get to keep in mind that attitude and efficacy are something that are a lot more just very organic to game design and gameplay. And I think as designers and developers and just people in the games industry, you already know that a game can influence an attitude, and a game can be part of an attitude, and a game can empower. And we'll talk about how specifically those apply to education in environmentalism here in a moment. But those are our three basic tiers. And without further ado, I will start us off with the only really, really high theory thing we're going to talk about here today, which is the types of knowledge. And there are three, you can probably argue about the terms I'm using here, but most environmental educators and most psychologists and educators would generally agree that there are three types of knowledge. And that's declarative, which is knowing that structural, which is knowing why, and procedural, which is knowing how. And we're not going to analyze in depth what all these mean, but as a quick overview, each of these kind of has a corollary. And declarative is kind of your awareness. I know that a fact is true. I know that today is Tuesday. I know that there is a climate crisis happening. I know that I really like Philly cheesesteaks. It's a weird example, but you know a thing. You have a fact in your head. Structural knowledge or systems knowledge is an understanding of why. You understand why a fact is true. I know that today is Tuesday because yesterday was Monday and tomorrow is Wednesday. I know why there is a climate crisis because I understand, or at least to some degree understand, the very complicated ecosystem of industrialization and waste management and politics, et cetera, et cetera. And then action knowledge at the very end is I can do something about it. I know how how I as an individual can act within the system and have an impact. I know how to recycle. I know how to sort my recycling. I know how to make a Philly cheesesteak sandwich. That action knowledge is the very operational skill set knowledge. Now, why are these important? Um, on an environmental level, these are important because the majority of environmental education, um, and this is changing these days, but the majority of environmental education over the past decades has been very focused on awareness, right? That, hey, there is a problem. Climate crisis is happening. Climate change is happening. And this can even be more detailed. It isn't always a broad strokes thing. You might know that flying is bad for the environment. You might know that eating a lot of meat is bad for the environment. But you might not know really how to impact these things or how to go about making these changes. Awareness knowledge is a wonderful and important thing. We need to know there is a problem before we can have an impact on it. And a lot of education around understanding that the climate is changing and that if we don't do something about it, there will be severe consequences. That's critical. We have to have that awareness. But now here's the problem is that if we stop at awareness knowledge, which a lot of education does, if we stop at awareness knowledge, we are not empowering individuals to make a difference. And in fact, in some cases, we're actually hurting their ability to make a difference because if I know that there is a problem, but I have no idea how I relate to that problem or how to have an impact or why it's happening, our brains are not meant to struggle with these issues. Our brains are meant to solve immediate problems, problem, solution, problem, solution. Big problems like that don't have obvious solutions, if I don't have the time to pursue the solution myself, we engage in fight or flight. We see this problem 200 years in the future, 300 years in the future, 10 years in the future, and we give up because we don't know what to do. And this is where you get climate denial. This is where you get climate apathy, climate nihilism, people who don't care because their mind is just protecting them from feeling so powerless. And this is why when we do environmental education these days, or where we're really trying to move, is towards systems knowledge and action knowledge. And I want to really point out that these are essentially the critical tools of games. There is not a game, video game, or handheld game, or sorry, handheld analog game that it doesn't involve some kind of system. You think about your most basic games, um, tic-tac-toe. You have a system. You have to understand why you've lost the game. You have to understand whose turn is next, what it means, what the victory condition is, what the loss condition is. Games are systems. They're rules. They are representations of those rules on a board or on a computer screen. And knowing how those system elements interact is how you learn to play a game. And knowing how to influence that system, that action knowledge, is the most involved element of any game you play. If I sit down at a computer and I don't understand the system, I don't understand how to play Civilization yet, what I'm going to do is take an action. I'm going to see how the system reacts, and I'm going to adjust that action. And I'm going to see how the system reacts, and I'm going to adjust that action. And I'm going to keep going down that pathway until I have a much stronger understanding of that system, until I understand why building this building is better than building this unit, until I understand why forming diplomacy is better than just war. And that's an example of a very complex system, but even in the simplest game like tic-tac-toe, you understand that by putting an X in this place, the system reacts, the player reacts, and the game continues. And I can see that play out very quickly and see how my actions influence that system. And why games are so critical is that games allow us to create contained, fast moving systems. Awareness knowledge cripples people in environmental action because they often can't see the consequence. They can't understand the system because the consequences are 5, 10 years down the line, thousands of miles away on the other side of the planet. The system is so large that they can't understand it. Their actions have consequences so removed from them that they do not get any system feedback. The power of games to educate about climate and to give behavioral transference for climate action is in showing those systems. And that is obviously it's not the only power of games, but this is where games can do something that very few other mediums could even attempt, giving people the ability to experiment in a complicated system and the agency, the actions, to understand how their actions impact the system because the player is the person making the system move. All right. That is my that is the heavy environmental psych part. We'll get to the more interesting part. Well, interesting to most people. This is the part that I really nerd out about. Um, and that brings us to the second tier, which is attitude. Now, attitude is something that is kind of that golden grail of environmental education. Trying to influence someone's attitude is not an easy thing. And if you watched Trevin York's presentation last week, I think you will have gotten a lot of information on that because his presentation really did a wonderful job of showing how complex attitudes are for any topic. And that goes doubly so when it comes to environmental, because these attitudes are usually tied to these three categories of what makes up the attitude. And through these three, through experimentation and research, empirically, psychologists have kind of identified that there are these three elements that are a good predictor of someone's intent, someone's attitude towards the environment, whether or not they want to be a good environmental actor. And those are their identity, their empathy, and their connection to nature. Now, identity is the most complex of those. And I'm going to be very clear that I'm not telling people that you should go out and try to influence other people's identities. I think that's an ethical decision that every designer or researcher needs to answer for themselves. What I am going to say, though, is that I think most of us as gamers, at the very least, if not game designers, know that games have a system for exploring identity that, again, is not really available in most other mediums. Identity, that complex idea of who am I Am I a Republican? Am I an environmentalist? Am I a vegetarian? Am I X, Y, Z? Those identities are normally very much tied to the world around us. And games and their ability to let us play with those identities, and to the point of today's presentation with pro-environmental identities, games allow a sort of removed experimentation. And a lot of studies have shown that people who live in places that are not necessarily friendly to pro-environmental attitudes and pro-environmental identities, or live in situations, not necessarily geographic regions, but people who don't feel safe identifying as pro-environmental do experiment with those identities in games, because you have a lack of consequence in your real world. If you feel social pressure to have a certain identity in the real world, that pressure isn't always present in a game. And so games do give us that power to experiment with what would it feel like to be an environmentalist? What would it feel like to be more outdoorsy? What would it feel like to be an environmental advocate? And so we have those identity experimentations. The second part of attitude is what we call is empathy. And we like to talk about emotional empathy and logical empathy. Emotional empathy is that I understand how someone feels. I understand that you're sad about the environment. I understand that you're stressed about the environment. Logical empathy is why, and that's where games really shine. I understand why because I understand the struggles you've gone through. And I think the best way to talk about this is through this wonderful example by there's a group here in Pennsylvania called Shavers Creek. It's a little nature preserve, and they have a wonderful education program. And one of the things that they've really advocated for is creating both emotional and logical empathy through creating specificity. Studies have shown that it's very difficult to emotionally empathize with an idea or a group. It is hard for me to say, I empathize with the natural environment. I empathize with birds. I empathize with people affected by climate change. It's a lot easier to empathize with a specific location or a specific animal or a specific person. And on a micro scale, a lot of educators these days are moving to things very simple that create a pathway for emotional connection and therefore emotional empathy, even by simply giving specific examples. Rather than saying birds are affected, they introduce a specific bird, talk about how this bird has been affected, and give that bird a name and really drive home that this bird is a living creature and this bird has an identity and this bird is going to continue to be this bird for the next X number of years and continue to be affected in this way for the next couple of years. And again, it's really easy to see where games are a wonderful medium for this kind of education, because we can establish connection to specific characters. We can establish longer narratives and emotional connections, and procedurally through mechanics and interaction within the game help establish what stressors, what struggles, what things these characters are having to overcome, and therefore why they have this feeling and why it's important to empathize with, or why, excuse me, uh, why uh, we might want to empathize with their struggles, because it's not just a way they feel, it's a system that is forcing them to feel this way because they're having to struggle with it. All right, so that's empathy in a nutshell. And then finally, we have the connection to nature, and um, this is a place where a lot of sort of serious games and AR games are trying to go these days, because connection to nature usually has sort of two understandings: that I can be connected to nature because I'm actually out in nature. And you can see that there's a lot of space for games, AR games like uh, Aris or Seek or iNaturalist, and gamified experiences that literally encourage you to be out in nature in your physical body. But also games allow people to connect to nature, and studies have shown through a simulation. Games like The Long Dark or Red Dead Redemption 2 that have a strong natural element have been shown to actually spark attitudes and connections to nature through simulation that lead to intent to become more involved with the natural environment. All right, so we have, as part of attitude, we've got our identities, we've got empathy, and we've got a connection to nature. Um, Together, these are predictors of how motivated someone is to act in a pro-environmental way. And then real quick, now this is something that I think I realized that would be a little bit too deep to dive into during this presentation, but I want to bring it up because those of you who are really doing in-depth design might be interested in some of the more, official frameworks for this kind of transfer of knowledge. One thing that we need to keep in mind when we're designing for attitude and designing for environmental attitude is that in-game attitude does not always transfer to out-of-game attitude, much less out-of-game behavior. Coors and a researcher named Coors and some colleagues in 2015 designed a wonderful model that if anyone's interested in, you can email me and my information's available at the end of the presentation. And I'd be happy to send you the details on it. But what it breaks down into is that if we want people to feel a way out of the game, we need to first empower them within the game to explore the attitude through mechanics, act on the attitude in a way that is impactful to the narrative and has consequences, either mechanically or narratively or to their character specifically. And then we need to work on transferring that out of the game by establishing a credibility of the message. And that credibility of the message is something that serious games really struggle with because the makers of those games don't always have the clout that a AAA game company might have. But it's something that AAA games really have a lot of power to leverage because a player is going to download a game knowing the developer, knowing the game is going to be high quality, or at least assuming it is. And when they have that respect for the creator, they're a lot more likely to believe the messages and then relate those and believe your explicit relation of those messages to their real life. And so, in a nutshell, when we're trying to transfer attitudes, we really need to empower those attitudes through experimentation in the game. And we need to foreground that the message is credible. And sometimes that's just from the sender. But if you don't have that credibility automatically, it's important to build that with the player through relating to facts, to giving them the agency to explore the validity of your message, because the kind of worst case outcome that shown by research is that if you give someone a message, environmentalism is important, et cetera, and then at the end of the day, they don't trust you, they're going to walk away feeling a little bit manipulated. And that's going to actually have a negative impact. And so it's important to build that trust and to build that credibility throughout game design or beforehand through just player-designer relations. All right. The last tier here is efficacy. And I'm really not going to talk about this one for very long because video games are efficacy machines already. And the most classic example of this is Super Mario Brothers. Here's a world. You don't know how to play at all. You are completely unskilled. Okay, I hit left and right. Okay, I can move. I've got a button that jumps. Okay, I figured out how to move. Here's an enemy. Jump on the enemy. Oh, wow, I did that. Here's a tower. Jump over this tower. Okay, I did that. Here's ramping challenge. Efficacy is this idea that I can do. I have an impact. I have an effect. I have empowerment in the world. And it is a critical mediator between knowledge and attitude and actual action. If someone feels like if someone knows what to do and intends to do it, but feels powerless, again, you engage that sort of uh, fight or flight attitude. They might just give up because they feel powerless. They might become apathetic. But video games already create power within a player. You start out Super Mario barely able to walk left and right. You end jumping off 7 enemies in midair to transfer from one area to another while dodging fireballs and bullets. Efficacy is built into games, and it's important because little acts in game, if those are attitude changes or taking actual actions to donate via the game, or planting a tree within the game, even if it has no impact on the real world, these actions spill over, because studies have shown that every little step you take, every baby step you take, encourages the next step. You start by recycling, you spill over, right? You fill the recycling cup with your efficacy, it spills over into the next cup. Then you start shopping local, that spills over. Then you start shopping organic, spills over. Then you join an advocacy group. These little baby steps that games already do, that are so ingrained in game design that if we didn't have efficacy building in a game, people would think it was either an artistic decision or a bad game. These are a critical element in environmental education that environmental educators and psychologists have struggled with for years, because rote education doesn't give a lot of pathways towards helping efficacy, whereas game design does. Okay, so we're at 2:33 my time, so we're 33 minutes into the presentation. Deborah, we've got about 10 minutes left. Is that correct?
Hello. 10 minutes of presentation or 10 minutes in total?
In total. It was 45 minutes total, right?
You've got an hour.
Oh, perfect. Oh, I thought
Yeah.
I was at 45. Look at me. Perfect.
So you've got more time if you want it. And if
That
you
is
want
that
to
is
go
good.
early, that's also okay. So.
No, this is perfect. This is time to do what we wanted to do. So you've got these, let me go back a bit. You've got these 3 pillars, and thank you, Deborah. Sorry, moving on. You've got these 3 pillars of environmental action, and empirically, just based on evidence alone, we're fairly confident as environmental educators that without all 3 of these, a person is never really going to commit to becoming a pro environmental actor. You can know how to do things, but not have the attitude and just not pursue it. You can have the attitude, but not the knowledge and not know what to do. You can have the attitude and the knowledge, but feel powerless and still quit because you just feel overwhelmed. And so we need all 3. And I think it's pretty safe to say that there's no one thing that can provide all 3. And to challenge ourselves as game designers or as industry professionals in whatever capacity to provide all 3 is setting ourselves up for failure. But longitudinally, every step towards establishing these is impactful, because attitude, knowledge, efficacy, every shred of evidence that we have says that these are built over time. You do not walk into a classroom and walk out knowing how to be a better environmentalist. You don't play a game and walk away saying, now I care about the environment. But every time you have those interactions, you move a little bit further on the scale. And so as game designers, as game developers, as game researchers, artists, whatever your role is, we have to ask ourselves, how can I, in what I'm doing now, connect to one of these 3 tiers even a little bit, to help my players, to empower them to take this next baby step? How can I empower their self-efficacy on this journey? How can can I introduce a tiny mechanic that gives just a little bit of action knowledge or helps explain a complex system just a little bit better than they might have known before? These are the challenges that we're looking at, not huge changes, not even changes that happen right then, but just the openness to connecting what we're already designing to these three tiers, because this is what a person needs. So what I'd like to do now, because I am ever the teacher, since we've talked about this, I'm going to employ this kind of knowledge theory idea, which is, use it or lose it. One of the core tenets of action knowledge, if you want someone to know how to do something, you have to introduce the knowledge and then immediately try to use it, or people forget. And that's not high theory, right? That's common sense. So what I'd like to do, and I'm going to have to ask Deborah again to help me out here, is go into breakout rooms for a minute and talk about, and I'll go to our next slide here, talk about within our groups how we might tie these concepts that we've just talked about to either future projects or projects we're working on right now. How can we adapt what we're doing, or how can we just think about this in the projects we're doing right now, using systems and action knowledge, working towards attitudes, or helping to build efficacy. And I'm thinking, I don't know how many people we got in the group right now.
There's 10
Okay.
people here.
All right. Deborah, would it be possible to just split us, I guess, into three groups?
Sure.
Is that cool?
Yes. Oh, now there's 9. So I guess we'll do 3 groups of 3.
Fair enough.
Okay. Sorry, give me 1 sec.
Oh, of course, of course. I'm gonna end my share at the same time. Oh, and before you hit the button on that, Deborah, I'm gonna end my share, and then I'm gonna send everyone a picture of this slide just so you can look at that if you want to. There you go. Oops. Actually, there you go. So that'll give you a link to that last slide so you can see that for reference.
Okay, I've opened all the rooms. There's one room with 2. I will pop into that one.
Perfect. And Deborah, are you cool? Maybe we end this in like 10 minutes and then come back to the main group.
Sounds good.
Is that good? Thank you so much for everything.
No problem.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Sind wir jetzt die Ersten oder sind wir wieder in Breakout?
Wahrscheinlich sind wir die Ersten, oder? Das,
Ich glaube, wir sind die Ersten, ja. Die anderen müssten noch kommen.
Sven, wo wohnst du? Wo bist du?
Bitte?
Wo bist du?
Ich bin in Berlin. Wo ist es in Berlin? Genau.
Schön.
Was ist Ebert?
Ich bin gerade in San Francisco.
Ich bin in London.
Ah, schön verteilt.
Ja, total.
Ja, jetzt werden meine beiden kleinen Kinder Mittagessen fressen in ein paar Minuten. Wir sind jetzt bei genau ein Jahr. Oh, ups, jetzt sind die anderen. Never mind. I'll stop talking.
Sure, okay. So funny. Our breakout room discovered that we all speak German. So that's
Nice.
hilarious. Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll wait for Clayton to come back and take over.
I'm very curious how that happened, if someone just started speaking in German without asking.
Well, I heard Sven's accent, which was German, that I know from having lived in Germany. And then Deb had said something in German on a call recently, and I was like, Deb speaks German. So yeah, it's pretty good, actually. Made me realize how much German I've forgotten.
Yeah. That's funny. Well, I hope, other than German, I hope we had a learning experience. Beyond that, I'm glad that learning experience happened, but I think, so we have a little bit of time left. I am, Deb, I'm not sure if we have enough time to do Q&A. If we do, I'd love to open the floor, because my group at least had some really awesome ideas and questions. And if others have questions, they can really, questions are what benefits the group, not answers, right?
Yeah, no, definitely have time. Go for it.
Sure.
I have a question. So Clayton, you talked about transferring like a message or like an attitude from inside the game, where the players already trust you and know what you're doing, and they're used to something to outside of the game. And I was wondering, I think that we talked about this earlier in other presentations as well. What's your thought on not necessarily inside the game, but inside the community on let's say a Facebook page where the players are in this close community where there is a lot of trust? What's your thought around building this kind of message that you, or attitude that you want to transfer from that place rather than from inside the game?
Awesome. Thank you. That's the aspect of the presentation I really wanted to shove in there, but we kind of ran out of time. But so first I want to say that if you're curious about pursuing like sort of community and social action in existing communities, there's an amazing book that came out last year called Locally Played by Benjamin Stokes, who is a professor at American University and founder of Games for Change. And it's a beautiful book about designing games for local community action, of all different kinds of action. But in a nutshell, I'm honestly just going to paraphrase his answers because they're much better than my ones I could come up with. And that's that if you're trying to engage in a community and empower action in that community, the responsibility of the designer is really to respect the community and to give their voice power, to meet them where they are and not ask them to change what they're doing, but empower what they're doing. And that starts with understanding the community first and through research and engaging in the communication channels they're already using, like you said, Facebook, or if that community is on Twitter, or if it's a physical community at a church or a park, something, but engaging with their space and then trying to find trying to find the priorities that they have, even if they haven't vocalized those priorities, even if the community doesn't know their priorities yet. The action about a community needs to be about giving voice to their priorities so that they can solve the issues that really affect them. And that's the whole idea Ben Stokes has in locally played. Local issues, local voices, local action, local consequences that is very visible. And so you feel like you're powerful because you saw it all happen right there in front of you. Does that begin to answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think I guess it makes sense, and something we do on a regular basis anyway, understand what motivates our players to play our games, and use that information to build on our roadmap and the feature development. And I guess the same thing really applies here as well, to understand where they're at and build on top of that, rather than shove a message in their face that might not be anything in their world or close to them. Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. I'm glad I could help. I think, again, an example of this that I think is important for the conversation is, and I can't remember if this is from Ben Stokes or Lindsay Grace also had a really wonderful book about social action in games, and that was last year too. He talked about how giving people messages that are well-intentioned can actually really, if you're not empowering their voice, can be a little hurtful sometimes. And we need to be careful, because I can tell someone all day, you should buy a hybrid car because that's great for the environment. But if that person makes minimum wage, their reaction to that is, I'm not rich, I can't buy a hybrid car. That feels a little judgmental or disrespectful of my situation. And so that's to Lindsay Grace, I think, made that point, that empowering those voices about knowing what's the right message first before trying to send it. I can't remember the name of his book this last year. I might have it on my desk, but I'd have to dig under the pile of 20 books to find it.
Trevin had his hand raised.
Oh,
We have time for another question?
Classic.
I know we're about time. Do we have time? Yeah, thank you. I'm very
Yeah,
good.
I'm not going to just shut it down, so it's fine.
All right, great.
People need to hop off. Obviously, feel free to hop off.
Okay, so Clayton, you talked about how games are uniquely positioned in many ways to provide this sort of systemic knowledge, this knowledge about the why, and how games are great at letting players explore systems and learn about them in a really accessible way. People can discern really complicated systems through gameplay. And you talked about how useful that is in building a player's ability to believe that they can make a difference in the game world and then outside the game world. My question is around how I know that often when we consider game systems and turning real world systems into game systems, where we build abstracted, simpler models to use in a game system, which also happens in education, right? When you teach a kid something, you're not teaching the real world system, you're teaching a simplified abstraction of it first. Mm-hmm. And then you get progressively more complex as they get older. My question is, is there any reading or thought process on how we might find the appropriate level of detail, the appropriate level of abstraction, the appropriate model to create a system so that players don't feel betrayed or manipulated when they find out? Because just as a quick example, when I was a little kid, I was taught that nouns are persons, places, or things. And then in middle school, a teacher was like, no, they're the names of persons, places, and things. And I felt very betrayed. And that was a bad feeling. How do we avoid that?
Thank you. First, I'm sorry for the betrayal. That's a hard lesson for a child.
Yeah.
But This is a difficult question to answer universally. I can say
Right.
that there are techniques that can help you find if you are doing a deep dive on a longer design project, there are techniques, and I would point you towards the research on knowledge structure, because the knowledge structure methodology is it's rooted in the cognitive sciences. You'll find a lot of research that is not applicable at all, but it's more and more being used for education and design. There are a lot of great tools there to measure, for lack of a better word, how your players or participants or students' knowledge is changing in a way that reflects the system. And what researchers do is they take, really simply, you do like a mind map, and an expert does a mind map and it looks like this, and an amateur does a mind map and it looks like this. And based on how your amateurs moving more closely to this expert, that's how well your system is portraying the system in a realistic manner without being so complicated that they can't approach it. It's hard to give a universal answer,
Awesome.
right? Because
Right. No, that's already, you gave me a direction to look.
yeah,
Thank you.
that is, I think, the best answer I could give, other than trust your gut as a designer and ask yourself,
Yeah.
would a player look at this and be able to act on this, or would they look at this and be like, I can't plant a tree. It's a lot harder than just walking up and dropping a seed on the
Right.
ground.
Cool.
Does that help?
Absolutely. I have a new direction to research. I'm excited.
Good. I'm glad that could give you a direction. Do we have others? I have all the time in the world. No, though I'm not going to make Deborah sit here and wait for me all day.
No problem. All good.
And I could also, let me drop my email in here. That way, if people do have sort of longitudinal questions that are like, or have some questions about some of the specific terms, I can send whatnot to people. Yeah. Long waited pause. All right, it seems like that might be it for questions. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. Thank you for all the work you're doing, for being part of the jam. Thanks to Deborah for organizing this whole thing, and for just, I guess, thanks to everyone for making me personally feel like I have power, because we all have a little bit of power to make a change. And so it feels really awesome to be part of something like this. So thanks so much for being here, everyone.